Hey, what's up? Welcome back. In this episode, you're going to learn how to accept a one-time payment using a custom form with the payment element. If you're looking for a simpler integration path, we have the no-code payment links option where you can set up a payment link directly through the dashboard and then share that with your customers through social media, email, text message, etc. Alternatively, there's another option called Stripe Checkout. This is a very simple integration that has one API call on the server. You redirect your customer to a Stripe hosted page. But in today's episode, we're going to talk about integrating the payment element. This allows you to build your own custom hosted form and collect lots of different payment method types. So the payment element supports anything from cards all the way to bank accounts. You've got support for wallets like Google Pay and Apple Pay, all the way to buy now, pay later like Affirm and Afterpay ClearPay. So it is a great option for building your own custom form to accept a one-time payment. So just as a quick roadmap for today, we're going to install a sample, then we're going to go through the dashboard and talk about how you can enable payment methods. These are going to be those payment methods that are dynamically rendered into the payment element every time the page loads. And then we're going to create a payment intent on the server and use its client secret to render the payment element on the client so that we can collect payment details from the customer. We'll ultimately submit that payment to Stripe. And then we're going to handle any of those post-processing events. We're going to talk about webhooks and a few other considerations that you might want to think about as you're building out your integration. So let's get into it. All right, here we are in Visual Studio Code. We're going to use the Stripe for VS Code extension today. If you haven't already installed this, you can head over to the extension gallery, search for Stripe, and install the extension. This uses the Stripe CLI under the hood. I've already authenticated with the Stripe CLI, and so I'm able to come down and use this start with a sample action. And today we're going to start with a starter sample. We're going to use the main integration with an HTML front end and Go on the back end. We're going to call our sample go starter-go, and that's going to download it into our local machine and install this sample. It's going to also have a couple of environment variables already set for us so that we don't have to go search around for our API keys. And it's really convenient to just get up and running and play around with some code to get started. We're going to say that we want to open this in the same window, and we're going to ignore that next prompt. So inside of the sample, we're going to have a client directory and a server directory. Inside of the server, this is the .env file that I was talking about that is pre-populated for you by the Stripe for VS Code extension when we install a sample. This has our API keys set for us. Now, if you had not already authenticated, or if you're installing this a different way, then you'll want to go over to your Stripe dashboard to the API key section and find your publishable key, your Stripe secret key, and drop those in here for test mode. Now, if we look down at server.go, there's a bunch of code that comes out of the box for us so that we don't have to write a lot of boilerplate. So the first thing I want to talk about is this /config route. That's going to return the publishable key from our environment variables. This is a best practice so that if we need to roll our publishable key, we can do so by just updating our env. We don't have to dig around in all of our front end code to figure out where we have put that publishable key. We've also got a webhook handler here already set up, and we're going to come back and take a look at this handle webhook route, and we'll actually handle some webhooks as part of our setup today. All right, so I'm going to open up the terminal here, and we're going to jump into the server directory, and we're going to say go run server. That is how we start up the server. So we're going to allow that. And then we'll bring up our browser here to localhost 4242 and look at what we start with. So this is a very simple sample app. If we look in the client side, we're going to see a very simple index.html file here that just has, we're installing Stripe.js at the top, and we have a simple H1. Next, we're going to go enable our payment methods in the dashboard. Now from the Stripe dashboard, we can head over to the settings and to the payment method settings. This is where we can manage our payment methods and enable or disable different ways that customers can pay through our payment element. So you'll see here that we have cards enabled, Link, Apple Pay, Google Pay, several different wallet methods. There's lots of different bank redirects. These are popular across Europe. We also have some buy now, pay later payment methods that are enabled. Finally, we even have ACH direct debit as one of the payment methods that customers could use. Now, if we wanted to enable Canadian pre-authorized debits, we could click turn on, and this would enable us to use Canadian pre-authorized debits as a payment method type inside of our payment flows. So this is where we manage our payment methods. And these are the payment methods that will be dynamically derived inside of our payment element when we render that and show it to customers. So that's how you enable and manage your payment methods. Instead of needing to deploy any new code, you can just come into the dashboard and enable or disable different payment method types. Here's a quick overview of the payment flow that we'll build today. When a customer lands on our page, we're going to make an AJAX request back to the server. The server is going to make an API call to Stripe to create a payment intent. We're going to use the payment intents client secret on the front end to render the payment element, and that'll allow us to actually collect payment details securely and submit those directly to Stripe. So for now, the first step that we want to do is head over to our server and make this API call that will create a payment intent. Back in server.go, we're going to add a new function here for handling payment intent creation. We're going to call it handle create payment intent. That's going to take in the response writer and also the request. The first thing we need to do is construct some params that will be used to create our payment intent. So we're going to say params is stripe.payment intent params. Now in here, we want to pass in an amount. This is the amount that we're going to charge. So in practice, you would want to probably look up the product in the database that you're about to sell, figure out the amount that you need to charge for this customer and enter that amount here. For today's demo, we're just going to hard code this. So we're going to pass in this value directly into stripe.int64. So we're going to wrap this up and we're just going to charge $10.99. So $10.99 here is an integer value in the smallest denomination possible for a given currency. We also need to specify the currency as stripe.string. This is going to be a string value. Inside of the Stripe Go library, we have a bunch of predefined currencies. So we can look for currency, and then let's actually set that to USD. All right. Now, we also want to enable those payment methods to be derived from the settings that we just configured in the dashboard. So we need to enable automatic payment methods. And this is going to be another sort of like sub hash that we're going to pass. And we can pull that also off of the Stripe Go client library using payment intent automatic payment method params, automatic payment methods params. And we're going to say that we want this to be enabled. So this one is going to be a Boolean and we're going to pass in true. Okay. So now that we have some params constructed, we can pass those in to create a payment intent. So we're going to say payment intent.new params, and this will return either the payment intent or the error. Now, if there was an error, we're going to parse out and see if we can grab the Stripe specific error. So we'll say if Stripe error or okay. Then we're going to just print out to the server log that we got a Stripe error. So we're going to say format.printf a Stripe error occurred. Okay, and that's going to be available in Stripe error.error like so. We're also going to render back some JSON. We have a helper already set up for us called write JSON error message. So we're going to use that, pass in our writer. We're also going to pass in, the value for that Stripe error.error. And we'll respond with a 400 status code. Now we've got some errors here, so let's make that. Next, what we want to do is if it was not a Stripe error, we're also going to just print out other error occurred. And we're going to just send in error.error. Again, we're going to write some JSON, write a JSON error message back with unknown server error and a 500. Okay, now what we want to do is render back the client secret property of the payment intent as JSON. So here we're going to say write JSON. And we're going to pass in our writer. We're also going to pass in a new struct. And this is going to look like this. So we're going to say client secret is going to be a string. And the JSON should have the client secret property like this. And we're also going to pass in that value straight off of the payment intent. So the client secret is going to be pi.clientSecret. And that should be good. We don't actually need to pass the writer when we're logging that out. Okay, so now we have this new function that will handle create payment intent requests. Now we need to map this to a route. So we're going to say http.handlefunc for create payment intent. That's the path. Handle create payment intent. That's going to be the function that we want to use as our handler. So now we can open up the terminal. We can restart our server, allow incoming requests, and then we can create another terminal session. We're going to use curl here to send a post request to localhost 4242/create payment intent. And that should give us back that JSON that has our client secret property inside. So this was the first step, which is to go to the server, make an API call to Stripe to create a payment intent, and then pass its client secret back. And now we're going to head over to the front end and use this client secret to render out the payment element into a custom form. All right, to jump into our front end, we're going to open up index.html here. Now notice again that at the top, we are installing Stripe.js from js.stripe.com, and that is a best practice. We want to load that on every page. There's some fraud detection tools that are built into that are going to be really helpful. All right, so let's say we want to accept a payment, and we need to add a form here that's going to have an ID. So we're going to say this is the payment form, and inside of our payment form, we're going to have a couple divs. And the first is going to be the payment element div. This is where we're going to actually mount the payment element. Now we just leave it as an empty div, and that's going to be the container where we put the payment element, and it's going to render out nice UI components for accepting lots of different payment method details. We're also going to have a div here for any error messages that might happen while we're trying to accept or submit payment to Stripe. Finally, we're going to have a button here that just says pay, and that should get us started. So if we refresh the page here, we'll see that we have a button. We don't actually render the payment element because we need to write a little bit of JavaScript here. So we're going to say script source, and we're going to create a new script file called payment.js. So we're going to make a new file here, and we'll save that as payment.js in the client directory. Now, when the DOM is fully loaded, we're going to fetch the publishable key and initialize Stripe. Then we're going to fetch the payment intents client secret. Finally, we're going to mount the elements. Okay, so first we're going to use the fetch API here to make a request to that /config route. And that's going to return a promise that will resolve with a response object that has this JSON property on it, JSON method on it, which again also returns a promise that we can await. And this will give us back our publishable key. Again, you could technically hard code this on the front end and pass in your publishable key directly to this Stripe constructor, but I would prefer passing in the publishable key from the server again so that we can control that from environment variables. That's especially useful when you have a mobile client. So imagine you've deployed some iOS app, a user installs the iOS app, and then they never upgrade it. If you've hard-coded your publishable key into that app, then it's going to be really challenging to roll that key if for some reason you need to swap out your publishable key. All right, let's fetch the payment intent from the server. This is going to be, again, a fetch call. This time we're going to pass to create payment intent. And this is going to be a post request. So we're going to say method is post. And we're going to pass in some headers here with a content type of application JSON. Now, if you wanted to, here's where you might pass in a body where you can sort of like stringify and pass in maybe the ID of the product that's being purchased, or maybe you want to pass in sort of a cart ID where you can look up in the database. We're not going to pass any body today. Again, we're just hard coding the amount. But after we've made this fetch request, this is again going to return a promise that will resolve with a response object that we want the JSON off of. So we're going to do this same little dance, and then we're going to await that result and grab out the client secret property. Now this client secret is something we're going to use when we construct some new elements. So here we're going to say stripe.elements. Now, typically when we call stripe.elements, that gives us back an elements group. And if you're familiar with the old style card element or any of the older style elements that are available through Stripe.js, usually this is how you would call the Stripe elements method to get back an elements group. Now, if we're using the payment element like we are today, we need to pass in the client secret for a payment intent. This client secret is used client side to determine which payment method types to display based on the configuration inside of that payment intent. Now we're going to create a payment element. So we're going to say elements.create and pass in the string payment. And finally, we're going to mount that payment element by calling .mount and passing in the CSS selector for that empty div that we have on index.html. So that's this CSS selector here. Okay, now if we refresh our page, we should see that our payment element is rendered. Now we're able to sort of collect payment method details. You can see here we have US bank account, Klarna. There's lots of different payment method types that are supported by the payment element. Very powerful stuff. But we haven't actually handled any submission of payment to Stripe. So let's do that next. Okay, we want to use JavaScript on the front end to intercept the submission of this form and then submit those payment details directly to Stripe. So here on the front end, we're going to grab reference to the form and we're going to say document.getElementById and pass in payment form. Now we want to add an event listener to the form for the submit event. Now by default, we're going to prevent default of that event so that it does not cause a full page submission. And next we're going to say stripe.confirm payment. This is going to actually submit the payment to Stripe. Now this is going to take in an options object where we need to pass reference to the elements group that we created earlier. There's also lots of other configuration here that you can pass in. One of those is confirm params, where we need to pass in the return URL. This is the URL to which the customer will be redirected after they go through the payment flow. Now, for now, I'm just going to say window.location.href.split on the question mark. We'll grab the first one off and add on complete.html. This is just going to redirect them to some page called complete.html that we haven't created yet. Okay, so stripe.confirm payment will return a promise. And most of the time, this is going to redirect us to this return URL after they've gone through the flow. But if the promise resolves with an error property, then we want to handle that. So if there's an error, we want to take the message from that and enter that into our messages div that we created earlier. So we're going to grab reference to that messages div by saying document.getElementById, error messages, and we'll say messages.inner text is equal to error.message. That's just in case something happens while we're attempting to submit those payment details. Okay, now let's go through the flow and see if we can submit a payment. So there's a test card number, all 4 twos. So we're going to grab that, enter in an expiration in the future, any CVC, and any valid zip here. And when we hit pay, we are redirected. Now it says 404 page not found, but we are redirected to complete.html. You'll notice that in the query string, we have the ID of the payment intent. We also have the client secret property for that payment intent, and we can use that client secret on the front end in order to re-retrieve the payment intent and then render out its details here on the complete page. So this is where you might implement like a confirmation page that shows the details of the payment. So we'll do that next. All right, we're going to create a new page here called complete.html, and that's going to be in the client directory. And I'm just going to copy most of what we already have in index.html. We'll change the h1 to complete, and then we're just going to have a bunch of closing tags here, and we'll format the document. Okay, so instead of payment.js, we're going to have complete.js just to separate the two. And in the body of this page, we'll have a pre-tag that has the ID payment intent, and we'll just render out the JSON for the payment intent. And then you can use your imagination for how you want to build out a confirmation page to maybe thank the customer for their purchase. All right, let's go implement complete.js, complete.js. Again, we want to wait until the DOM is fully loaded, and we are going to fetch the publishable key and init stripe. Then we're going to use the params to retrieve the payment intent and render the payment intent JSON. Okay, so the first thing we want to do here is we're going to say the publishable key is await fetch /config. Okay, const stripe is equal to stripe. We're going to pass in that publishable key. Next, we're going to use the params to re-retrieve the payment intent. So we need to create a params object, which is going to be a new URL search params, and that's going to accept in window.location.href. And params has this method on it called get, where we can pass in the query string key. So payment intent client secret, all snake case, is going to give us back the client secret property of the payment intent. Now we can use that client secret property to re-retrieve the payment intent on the front end using Stripe.js. So stripe.retrieve payment intent accepts a client secret property and returns a promise that will resolve with either an error or this payment intent property. And we should then be able to render that payment intent back out as JSON into that pre tag we created earlier. So let's just say we want that payment intent pre off of the document, payment intent, and we're going to say payment intent pre dot inner text is going to be some JSON, and we're going to pass in the payment intent and null2 just so that it looks nice. Okay, so if we refresh the page, again, it's going to use those query string values in order to re-retrieve the payment intent, and something is not working right. So let's pop open the console and see what's going on. We misspelled secret somewhere. So this should be client secret. Okay, and let's try this one more time. Okay, look at that. We see the details of the payment intent. We can see the amount that was charged. We see the status down here is succeeded. So that is looking really good. Obviously, this is very crude, and you can use your imagination for how you might want to display the confirmation page. All right, we've got our confirmation page. However, you don't want to use the confirmation page as a signal for fulfillment of an order. You don't want to actually fulfill an order based on the request to retrieve this confirmation page. Instead, you must use a webhook handler. And the reason is that if for some reason the browser crashes or the computer crashes or the client's internet goes down, or for some reason they close their computer or their battery died, there's several different reasons why payment might be successful, but this page does not load. And as a result, what you want to do instead is use a webhook handler. So we're going to go talk about how we might build and test that. So recall that we have this handle webhook function that is routed based on requests that are being sent to the /webhook route. Now in the Stripe for VS Code extension here, I can open this up. There's a couple tools here for forwarding events. So I can actually just say, I want to forward events to localhost 4242/webhook. This will fire up a listener that will forward events that happen on my Stripe account to my local running server. So if we were to just browse back to the root route here and recall that as soon as we load this page, we're creating a payment intent, we can see in the logs for this listen command or this forward command that a payment intent.created event just fired. So inside of this log, we also see that a post request was sent to our webhook handler and we got a 200 status code response back. So if we look inside of the body here, we'll notice that at the very bottom, we have a check for the event type. And in this case, it's looking for checkout session completed. That's for a little bit different type of integration. So here we're actually going to say payment intent.succeeded. And when the payment intent succeeds, we want to log some message out to the console. And for this case, let's just say that we want to, we'll put out a money bag and payment succeeded. All right. Now, inside of our server log, because we made a change, we want to restart our server. Then we're going to go back through our payment flow here one more time. So we're going to refresh the page. Again, another payment intent is created. We're going to enter in these test payment card details and hit pay. And you'll see several events are going to fire. One of them is this payment intent succeeded event. So again, we're looking at the logs for that listen command or that forward command. We're also seeing charge.succeeded. So there's going to be several other potential events that fire at the same time. But if we look back at the server log, we can see that this was printed out payment succeeded. So this is where you would actually handle your fulfillment logic. Webhooks are superior for lots of different reasons, but one great reason is even if your server goes down, Stripe will continue to retry delivery of those webhook event notifications for up to 3 days with exponential backoff. So you can still sort of catch up and make sure that you have fulfilled all of the orders that might have happened. You might be wondering how to test out your integration. Well, over in the documentation for accepting a payment, you can drill down into the test integration section, and for each of the different payment method families between cards, wallets, bank redirects, etc., there are several different things that will allow you to test different scenarios. So for instance, we can grab this card, this test card that ends in 3155, and we can use that as one of our test cards inside of the payment element. And you'll notice that as we go through the payment flow here, this will trigger a secure customer authentication payment flow. So this is going to pop up a modal, and in production, this modal would contain a bank account, 2FA, or sort of like a one-time code or some way to verify that the customer is who they say they are and that they are allowed to authenticate this payment. So that's one way that you can test sort of 3D secure and secure customer authentication is with that special card number. Another thing worth noting is in the documentation, there are some optional steps depending on specific payment method types or QR code based payment methods. These might require that you pass additional details when creating the payment intent, or they might have other considerations like with Apple Pay, you'll need to go into the dashboard and make sure that you have an Apple Pay domain set up and verified. So just to review the entire flow, the customer lands on the page and we use any information from that page to create a payment intent using the API. And then when we return that payment intent's client secret to the client, we use that to build out a payment element on our custom form. That's where customers enter their billing details, and then we can submit that payment directly to Stripe client side, and then the customer is redirected to a return URL where we display this return status or this success status, completion status. And finally, we're handling fulfillment with our webhook. That's where we're actually pulling from inventory and printing shipping labels and doing all of those things that we might do when someone buys something from us. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.